Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Man by the Lake. It was supposed to be a special trip, just me, my husband, and our loyal dog for our 10-year anniversary. We wanted peace and quiet away from everyday distractions, so we left our young son with my mother-in-law and headed for a secluded national park about an hour from home. It was late September, and although the air had cooled and the leaves had begun to change, the forest still held that quiet magic. The camping area was dotted with small lakes and winding trails, and though a few people remained, it was far from the busy season. We chose a quiet lakeside spot, the water still and reflecting the sky like polished glass, and set up camp just before dusk. After settling in, we decided to hike a short trail looping around the lake. Along the way, we passed another campsite directly across the water from ours. A young man, perhaps in his late 20s like us, stood silently beside a small tent. When we greeted him, he didn't reply, just stared. It was a little unsettling, but we brushed it off, thinking perhaps he was just shy or introverted. We returned to our camp, finished setting up, and cooked dinner over a fire. The evening was peaceful until the dog began barking furiously into the darkness. She was tied to a long leash and wasn't usually anxious, so we paid attention. My husband grabbed his headlamp while I leashed our dog, both of us scanning the woods for animals. The darkness was thick, and the forest gave nothing away. We assumed maybe it was a deer, or possibly even a bear, though it was strange that it hadn't been scared off by the light and noise. My husband walked toward the path that connected to the other campsite when he stopped suddenly. There was something lying on the ground. When he got closer, he called back to me. It was a person, lying face down. For a split second, dread sank into my stomach. But then the figure stood up. It was the man we'd seen earlier, the silent one from across the lake. His face was pale and void of expression. He said nothing, only warned me to keep the dog away, and then walked directly into our campsite, past us, and sat by our fire like he belonged there. He didn't offer an explanation, not even a greeting. He didn't laugh when we joked nervously about thinking he was a bear, nor did he react when we asked why he'd snuck up on us in the dark. His leg was soaked through, suggesting he'd stumbled into the water. He carried a large knife on his belt, not unusual in the wilderness, but combined with his silent demeanor and the way he kept slipping his hands into his pockets, like checking for something, it made my skin crawl. The dog never stopped growling, eyes locked onto him the entire time. For 30 minutes he sat there, barely speaking, and then just stood up and mumbled something about returning to his sight. We watched him go, but not before exchanging an unspoken agreement. We weren't going to sleep in that tent tonight. My husband didn't argue. The man's silent intrusion and refusal to explain himself had shattered any sense of safety we felt. We began packing up in the dim light of the fire, trying to stay quiet but working quickly. Our car was close, and we kept the dog on alert as we loaded our gear. Then we saw it, a faint beam of light from the path leading back from his sight, cutting briefly through the trees. He was coming back. Maybe he thought we were asleep now that the fire had died down. Whatever his reason, we didn't wait to find out. We drove off, hearts pounding, the forest quickly disappearing in the rearview mirror. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why had he come in the first place? What would have happened if the dog hadn't barked? The weapon on his belt wasn't proof of bad intentions, but it didn't ease the dread either. And why sneak across the dark woods only to sit silently by a stranger's fire? There was something unexplainably wrong about it all, something primal. It felt less like an encounter with a socially awkward camper and more like the beginning of something sinister that we had narrowly avoided by leaving when we did. The next day, I kept playing the night over in my mind. His face, the way he moved through the dark, the silence that followed him. I told myself I'd overreacted, that maybe he was just lonely or confused. But a part of me, a deeper, instinctual part, refused to believe that. I remembered the look in his eyes, empty, unreadable. I remembered how he hadn't smiled, not once, even when we tried to make light of the situation. I remembered how his eyes kept tracking the dog, like he couldn't stand not knowing where she was. And I remembered how relieved I was when we finally locked the car doors and drove away into the night. It occurred to me later that he had put a lot of effort into being unnoticed. He'd crawled through the woods in total darkness, without a flashlight, and approached silently enough that only the dog heard him. He wasn't walking along the trail casually, he was stalking. What kind of person does that? If he just wanted company, why not approach in the daylight? Why slink through the woods like a predator? And what if the dog hadn't barked? Would he have just slipped past the tent and moved on? Or would we have woken up to find him standing over us? Camping had always been something I loved. The peace of the woods, the crackle of the fire, the escape from noise. But that night changed something in me. The silence no longer felt comforting. It felt like something could be hiding in it. Even now, when I hear a twig snap or a branch creak while walking my dog in the early evening, I find myself scanning the shadows, looking for movement. Not bears or coyotes, but people. Because as terrifying as nature can be, it's nothing compared to what someone with bad intentions can do under the cover of night. In the days that followed, I searched online forums and local news, half expecting to read about something awful happening at that campground, but nothing came up. No missing persons, no reports, nothing. He was just a strange man who came and went in the dark, leaving behind a feeling I still haven't shaken. Some friends laughed it off. Others said we were lucky. A few even told us we were paranoid, but deep down, I knew we had narrowly escaped something that night. I don't know if he planned to harm us, but I know he wasn't just there to talk, and I know our dog, bless her, probably saved us from finding out the hard way. Story 2. The Hermit's Warning. My grandfather told me the story so many times, and each time, his voice would change ever so slightly, not out of fear, but something deeper. Are we, maybe? Or wonder? Or something he couldn't quite name. Back in the 1970s, he had an old hunting buddy who lived like a hermit in the remote reaches of the Pacific Northwest. He'd built himself a cabin in the dense Cascades, so deep in the woods that it took nearly an entire day's travel to reach him. There were no roads once you left the small mountain town, just narrow trails, trees older than most countries, and the silence of unspoiled wilderness. He didn't have running water or electricity. He didn't want them. The forest, he'd say, provided everything he needed. When my grandfather stayed with him on a hunting trip, the first thing he noticed was how still it was. The kind of stillness that didn't just settle around you but pressed into you, filled your ears, until the absence of sound became a sound all its own. The cabin itself stood on stilts on a steep slope. There were no steps or ladder, just a 10-foot drop beneath a balcony that wrapped halfway around. This was how the hermit liked it. No easy way for anything to get in. My grandfather, a seasoned hunter and state trooper at the time, chuckled at the man's paranoia, assuming it was just eccentricity born from solitude. But that first night, everything changed. They sat together after dinner, talking quietly while the forest darkened outside. My grandfather said the man's tone shifted suddenly. He leaned in, serious and hushed, and told him, "They're out here, you know. You have to be careful at night." Grandfather laughed, assuming he meant bears or cougars. But the man didn't smile. Instead, he stepped outside onto the balcony, placed a bowl of bread, fruit, and jerky on the edge, and said, "It'll be gone by morning." With that, he returned inside and said nothing more about it. The cabin was small, a single room with cots and a cast iron stove. That night, my grandfather took the bed nearest the window overlooking the balcony. He couldn't sleep. It wasn't the cold or the sounds of the woods. There were no sounds, no wind, no birds, no rustling branches, nothing. He lay there in silence, trying not to let his mind wander, when he heard it, a soft rustling outside the window. Not fast, not like a raccoon scurrying. Slow, deliberate, like something large trying to move without being noticed. He turned his head and saw it. The bowl was empty. That wasn't the strange part. It was the hand, 4 long fingers, pale and smooth, gently pulling back over the balcony's edge. That was all he saw before it disappeared. He stayed frozen for what felt like hours, heart thudding loud enough he swore it waked the whole forest. The next morning, he didn't say a word about it. Neither did the hermit. It was like they had shared something unspoken, a secret past between those who had seen beyond the veil. My grandfather left the next day and never returned to that part of the mountains. He never again hunted in the Cascades. He would sometimes try to rationalize it, say it was a bear or a raccoon standing on hind legs, but he'd always go quiet halfway through. He'd glance off into the distance, like trying to remember a dream that didn't belong to him anymore. There was something about that night that never let him go. Years later, he told me the story again when I was old enough to understand. I asked him why he didn't investigate, why he didn't go outside with his flashlight or his gun. He shook his head slowly, eyes still fixed on something only he could see. "You don't chase something like that," he said. "If it wanted to be seen, it would have stayed." He always believed that some places weren't meant for people, that parts of the world still belonged to something older. The forest, he said, remembers, and sometimes it listens, and sometimes it watches. You just have to know when you're being watched. He didn't believe it was evil, just different, a kind of presence that existed beyond our understanding. He thought it might even been curious, reaching out in its own strange way. Maybe that's why the hermit left offerings, not out of fear but out of respect. You don't own the wilderness, he'd say. You pass through it, and if you're lucky, it lets you leave. That lesson stayed with me all my life. It made me careful where I set my tent, where I let my fire burn, and how loudly I spoke in the woods. The trees don't like arrogance, he warned, and neither do the things that live among them. I told that story once on a camping trip with friends, and someone laughed, calling it a Bigfoot tale. Maybe it was. Or maybe it wasn't any creature we have a name for. Some stories aren't meant to explain, only to pass on. I never met the hermit myself. He died before I was born. But I remember the way my grandfather spoke of him, with reverence and unease. He wasn't just a man who lived alone in the woods. He was someone who knew things most of us never would, someone who had made peace with whatever watched him at night. Now, whenever I walk alone in the woods, I feel it too, that same stillness, that heavy hush that tells you you're not alone. And every so often, I'll leave a little offering, not because I'm afraid, but because I've come to understand. Some things don't need to be seen. Some things don't need to speak. They're out there, in the quiet places, waiting and watching. And if you're wise, you won't ask too many questions. You'll feel it when they're near, the sudden silence, the weight in the air, the feeling that the trees are holding their breath. So when I go into the forest, I carry my grandfather's story with me like a compass. I remember the bowl, the fingers, the silence that followed. I don't mock the idea of what he saw. I honor it, because I felt it too now. The moment when the forest turns quiet, and your breath slows, and your skin tightens as though something just brushed past you in the dark. And in that moment, I whisper a thank you for letting me walk through, for letting me leave, and for reminding me that we are guests in this world. And sometimes, just sometimes, the hosts come to say hello. Story 3. The Easter Bunny and the Visitors. There are memories from childhood that feel like dreams, like soft distortions of time that unravel the moment we try to examine them too closely. For most of my early life, I had one such memory, visits from the Easter Bunny, not the one from books or cartoons, but something else. Starting when I was around 6 years old, I believed, no, I knew, that the Easter Bunny would take me to the North Pole every Christmas Eve. I never told anyone but was warned not to. "It's our secret," he said. "If you tell, I won't come back." The memory was vibrant and oddly specific. I can still feel the excitement, how it rivaled Christmas morning itself, but it wasn't until years later, after the final trip, that I began to wonder if what I remembered was something more than just imagination. These trips, as odd as it sounds, didn't happen in the physical world. It felt more like slipping into another state, something between dreaming and consciousness, like stepping into a space just one layer removed from ours. Each time I would wake in my bed on Christmas Eve, feel a pull, and then I would find myself at the North Pole. It wasn't the jolly candy-coated place from holiday movies. It was geometrical, two-dimensional almost, like a projection. We played games, strange, logic-based puzzles and memory tasks that were somehow incredibly fun. And though I can't recall the exact details of those games, I remember the feeling of joy and belonging. Then, one year, when I was around 7, he told me it would be the last visit. "You're getting too old," he said. I was devastated. After that, he never came again. Years passed, and I buried those memories, chalking them up to a child's vivid imagination. But then, when I was 9, something happened that changed everything. I was led outside in the middle of the night. I say led, but I can't remember by whom or what. Just a sensation, like being gently pulled by invisible hands. The yard was bathed in a surreal light, not bright like daylight, but clearer than moonlight, as if the stars had stepped closer. The thick jungle of trees and plants in our yard faded into the background. I was being guided to a small patch of grass, a place I had sleepwalked to several times before, and there, hovering above the grass, was a silver craft. Not the large saucers people describe, but a tiny disc, perhaps 5 feet tall, and no more than 12 feet across, floating silently about 4 feet off the ground. As I stood there, a figure approached. A grey, the stereotypical alien I'd seen on TV only months prior. Small in stature, no taller than I was at 9 years old. It didn't acknowledge me, but also didn't scare me. I should have been terrified. I had nightmares about creatures like this after seeing them on late night shows, but at that moment I felt calm, peaceful even. The shipper markings etched into its surface, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, only more abstract, more alien. I don't remember walking into the craft, only that I was suddenly inside it. The room I entered was much larger than the ship's exterior would suggest. I was seated at a clear glass screen, with a grey being across from me. We were interfacing with the screen, seemingly communicating through it. There was no fear, only focus. The device resembled a sleek console, and I somehow understood what to do. It felt like a learning exercise, a translation task. I typed in English, and something in the screen responded in symbols. Strange, fluid lines that weren't letters but concepts. The grey didn't speak, at least not with a voice, but I could sense its thoughts, faint, guiding, curious. At one point I laughed, wondering why we were using the screen when we could simply communicate through thought. It was a strange joy, the kind of joy you feel when you solve a problem you didn't know you were capable of solving. It was fun. I felt like I was contributing to something larger, something important. Then everything went dark again, And the next thing I knew, images began playing directly into my mind, like movies, but not with eyes, projected into thought. The first was beautiful. I was moving through a prehistoric ocean inlet, the land lush and untouched, vibrant with colors no longer seen in our world. It was the earth, ancient and pure, the water pristine, the jungle humming with life. I felt a deep sadness and love for this world I had never known. The second image was far darker. I saw breakwaters and lighthouses being consumed by rising seas. Waves devoured coastlines, and the sky was heavy with smoke and storm. A voice, not spoken but understood, told me, "This is what your kind is doing." I felt the weight of responsibility pressing against my chest. When I woke the next morning, I didn't feel fear. Not exactly. I felt full, overwhelmed. My mind buzzed with images and messages, like trying to hold on to a dream that's already slipping away. And the strange part, I wasn't afraid of the grey. Despite all my childhood fears, it had felt familiar, like an old friend returning to finish a conversation. But what disturbed me most was the loss of the message. I tried desperately to remember what I was supposed to do, what I was meant to take away from the experience, but all I had were those two visions, the untouched earth and its drowning future. Years passed. I told no one. I convinced myself it was just an unusually vivid dream, maybe sparked by the old Easter Bunny delusions, but the memory refused to fade. Then by chance I came across a lecture by a man named Jim Sparks. He spoke of his own experiences, of being placed in front of a glass screen, translating language with grey beings, of being shown images of environmental devastation. His account echoed mine so closely I felt sick. He described things I had never told anyone, things I couldn't have invented. It was like hearing someone else narrate your own memories. And though he made some outlandish claims that I don't endorse, the core experience, the interaction, the messages, matched mine exactly. Today I work as an environmental scientist. A strange path, I suppose, for someone with buried memories of alien visitors, but in a way, it fits. I never allowed those memories to control my life, yet I now recognize they may have guided it. I don't know what that experience really was. I don't claim to understand who or what those beings were, or why they came to me, but I no longer deny it. The calmness I felt, the sense of purpose, even if the message faded, the feeling didn't. Something wanted me to remember those two truths. The earth was once beautiful beyond imagination, and we are responsible for what comes next. So I live with that. Not in fear, but in humility. The Easter Bunny may have been a child's way of understanding the unexplainable, a mask for something ancient and otherworldly. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But every now and then, when the wind changes direction or the sky darkens with a storm that feels too big for its season, I look up and wonder. I remember the tiny silver craft and the gentle being who never spoke. And I listen, not with my ears, but with whatever part of me still remembers how it felt to be lifted from sleep and shown the truth behind the veil. Story 4. The Silent Triangle. I was a kid when it happened, back in 1981, living in rural Montgomery County, Indiana. My brother and I were outside, playing in the front yard of our neighbor's house on what felt like an ordinary afternoon. The sky was clear, the air still, and the sun was making its slow descent behind the trees. My dad was a state trooper, and we'd grown up around helicopters and aircraft, so we were no strangers to what things in the sky were supposed to look or sound like. I understood that helicopters hovered with a loud thump, that planes moved steadily with the roar of an engine. I knew what was possible. That day I saw something that wasn't. We were facing the neighbor's house when my brother pointed upward, his voice trailing off in disbelief. Above the rooftop, hovering in the sky, were two silver discs, one slightly higher than the other. They rotated slowly, as if suspended by invisible strings. At first I thought they were balloons, or maybe some new kind of aircraft I hadn't seen before, but they didn't move like anything I recognized. They stayed fixed for what felt like minutes. We both stared, eyes wide, trying to convince ourselves this was normal. But nothing about it was. The sky was too still. The silence too perfect. Then, without warning, both discs accelerated and shot off to the east with such incredible speed that my brain couldn't comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't a slow build of movement. It was instantaneous, like they were never really there at all. My brother and I sprinted into the house, breathless and panicked, trying to explain what we'd seen. Our parents didn't mock us. In fact, they remembered how frightened we were. To this day, if my brother hadn't been there, I might have chalked it up to a dream, but he was. We both saw it. It was real. And that wasn't the end of it. Around that same time, I had a dream, or what I thought was a dream. It began like so many others, with me clinging to my old security blanket, something I carried everywhere like a talisman. That night I found myself in a massive room. I couldn't see the ceiling, but I was on a walkway, peering down at strange holes in the floor. I convinced myself that something lived down there, though I never saw what. There was a light ahead, and figures, beings, stood beneath it, watching me. They didn't speak, not in words anyway, but their presence was undeniable. I remember feeling exposed, like I was being examined. At some point I dropped my blanket into one of the holes. It was a small moment, but somehow it felt important, humiliating even. The next morning I woke up without it. We searched everywhere. Our house wasn't large, and I had never sleepwalked before, yet the blanket had vanished without a trace. It was yellow, marked with a small burn from one of my mum's cigarettes, a detail I love for reasons I still can't explain. My parents replaced it with a blue one, but it was never the same. Something had taken it, and I didn't know how to get it back. After that, the memory lingered, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I was never quite sure if it was real, until I remembered the discs, the way they hovered, the speed at which they vanished. The connection felt undeniable. And even stranger, I began to hear other stories, accounts of similar shapes in the sky, silent and swift. I never told anyone about the dream, not for years. I didn't want to be laughed at, but deep down I knew something had happened. And even if I couldn't explain it, I could never forget it. Over the years, I've considered hypnosis. I've wondered if I could retrieve more of the memory, piece together the fragments of something so far beyond my understanding. But part of me fears what I'll find. What if it wasn't just a dream? What if I really was taken, examined, and returned without explanation? And what if the blanket wasn't lost but taken deliberately, like some kind of token or sample? The questions kept me awake at night, long after the memory itself had faded from conversation. The strange part is, I don't feel fear when I recall it. I feel curiosity. The beings, whatever they were, didn't seem hostile. They seemed methodical, focused. And while the dream carried a sense of vulnerability, it wasn't terror. It was more like being observed by something trying to understand me. Maybe that's all they wanted, a glimpse into our world, a sample of our lives. Maybe the blanket meant more to them than I'll ever know. Maybe it was never about me, but about understanding the bond we form with simple things. I still live in Indiana, not far from where it happened. And sometimes, when the sky is particularly clear, I find myself looking up, half expecting to see those silver discs return. I haven't. Not yet. But I believe they're still out there, watching, waiting. And maybe, someday they'll return not with fear but with understanding. Until then I carry the memory quietly, like a bookmark left in a forgotten chapter. I don't know what they wanted, or why they chose me. But I know this. Some stories don't fade with time. They linger in the corners of your mind, whispering that the world is far stranger than we let ourselves believe. Story 5. The campground above the river. It was sometime in the mid-1980s when my parents took me and a close friend camping along the Columbia River in Oregon. It wasn't deep wilderness, but one of those quiet campgrounds tucked just off the riverbanks, part of a KOA-like chain my mom enjoyed for their basic comforts. We were nestled between trees, near the soft rush of the river, and although the area wasn't crowded, a few other families dotted the grounds. My friend and I, both kids at the time, were thrilled to be on our own in a tent next to the trailer. We stayed up late, fueled by soda, and the kind of endless energy only kids can manage, playing board games and laughing into the night. Eventually the laughter gave way to stillness, and a quiet came over us that felt more sacred than eerie. Around midnight, both of us had to go to the bathroom, which meant a short walk up the trail to the campground's facilities. Neither of us thought much of it. We'd made that walk during daylight a few times already. But the moment we stepped outside, something felt off. The night, which had been alive with the croaks of frogs and the steady background hum of crickets, had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that presses into your chest and makes you forget how to breathe for a moment. I stopped walking, and my friend instinctively threw an arm in front of me. We stood there in the middle of the gravel path, the darkness suddenly impossibly thick. He raised a finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. Then I noticed what had caught his attention. Something above us was blocking out the stars, not just a single patch of sky, but a wide swath, slowly revealing the stars behind it as it moved from right to left. It didn't make a sound. No humming, no rushing air. Just a quiet, void-shaped shadow in the sky, blacker than the night around it. The way it moved was what chilled me the most. Imagine holding up a massive sheet of cardboard overhead in the dark, slowly dragging it across the sky. That's what it looked like. As it passed, the stars returned behind it, one by one. It was huge too, far too large to be any conventional aircraft. And despite its size, it left no trace, no lights, no vibrations, not even a breeze. Just that unbearable silence. When it finally passed over the tops of the trees and disappeared from view, the sounds of the night returned all at once. The frogs, the crickets, they resumed their symphony like nothing had happened. We didn't speak on the way back to the tent. What could we say? The moment had soaked into our bones, and trying to explain it out loud felt impossible. The next day, we decided not to mention it to anyone. Part of us hoped someone else in the camp would bring it up first, that someone else had seen it too, but no one said a word. The other campers chatted about fishing, hiking, and the weather, none aware of the silent visitor from the night before. That silence became more unnerving than the experience itself, as if we'd seen something we weren't meant to. We stayed at that campground for a few more nights. Each evening, I found myself looking up, half expecting it to return, but it didn't. The sky stayed filled with stars undisturbed. Still I couldn't unsee it. The image of that massive shape blotting out the stars haunted my dreams and crept into my waking thoughts. It didn't feel like a machine. It felt like something alive, something ancient. And even now, all these years later, I can close my eyes and see it moving silently above us, as if it's still up there, just beyond the reach of our awareness. I never reported what I saw. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't write it down. For years I carried the memory in silence, not out of fear but out of reverence. Some things I've come to believe don't need to be explained. They simply are, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't trying to hurt us or frighten us. It was just passing through, as if we weren't even there. Or maybe we were, and it just didn't care. Either possibility was equally humbling. It was like being reminded, in the quietest way imaginable, of how small we really are. Since then, I've read other stories, accounts of silent, triangular or rectangular crafts that move through the night without a sound. Some people claim they're military aircraft. Others say they're alien in origin. I don't pretend to know. But I do know this. Whatever we saw that night wasn't ordinary. It didn't behave like anything built by human hands. And the way the night itself seemed to acknowledge it, the way the forest held its breath until it was gone, that was the most convincing evidence of all. Nature knows, sometimes before we do. To this day, I don't walk at night without remembering that slow-moving shadow. Whenever I find myself in the woods under a star-filled sky, I watch the constellations a little more carefully, and if I ever see the stars blink out again, I won't be afraid. I'll stand in silence, just like I did that night, and I'll listen, not for sound, but for the absence of it. For the void that moves like it's always been here, older than our cities, older than our questions. And when it passes again, I'll watch the stars return, one by one, and know that something out there is still watching us back. Story 6. The Yellow-Eyed Figure. This is my father's story, passed down with a weight in his voice that never quite lifted. It happened when he was still young, camping with his parents near Lake Tahoe, long before the campsites became more commercialized. It was the early 1970s, and they had chosen a quiet stretch of wilderness that bordered deep pine forest and rolling hills. The air was clean, the kind of clean that makes you breathe deeper without realizing it. But from the moment they arrived, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, nothing loud or obvious, but an uneasiness, like eyes hidden just beyond the trees, watching from a distance that couldn't be measured. That feeling clung to them throughout the day. My grandfather, a practical man who rarely gave in to paranoia, mentioned more than once that he had the distinct sensation they were being observed, not by animals, but something else, something heavier. He brushed it off, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, watching the tree line when he thought no one noticed. That night, after dinner and stories around the fire, they all retired to their tents, but my grandfather, stubborn and protective, chose to stay up. He stoked the fire higher than usual, claiming he didn't feel tired. My father and grandmother fell asleep to the sound of wood crackling and flames dancing against the dark. It was around 3:45 a.m. when my grandfather peered out through the flap of the tent. What he saw would become one of the most terrifying moments of his life. Circling the fire in complete silence was a tall, black figure. It wasn't an animal. It was humanoid, large with elongated limbs and movements too deliberate to be beast-like. My grandfather's first thought was intruder, maybe some forest dweller. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized something far worse. The figure had no face, no clothes, just a smooth outline, impossibly dark, except for its eyes, bright, glowing yellow eyes that pulsed like dim lanterns in the night. Frozen in place, my grandfather didn't move, didn't breathe. He watched as the creature completed its silent circle around the fire, never turning its gaze away from the center. Then the smell hit him, sickly sweet at first, then rotting and chemical, like something that had died years ago, but never decayed completely. It filled the air, suffocating and unnatural. My grandfather slowly zipped the tent back up, careful not to make a sound, and sat with the rifle in his lap, waiting. Hours passed. No sound, no movement. When dawn finally cracked our eyes and the figure was gone, he didn't tell my father or grandmother right away. He just said they were leaving, packed up the tent and supplies in record time, and drove until they reached the first gas station miles down the road. Only then, when the morning sun had fully risen, did he tell them what he saw. My father was young, but he never forgot the look on his father's face. Pale, rigid, unreadable. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was the look of someone who had witnessed something they couldn't make sense of, something that didn't belong in the world they thought they knew. Years later, my father would tell me the story on a cold evening while we sat by the fire in our own backyard. He admitted that it had stayed with him ever since. Not the story, but the feeling, that quiet dread, the belief that there are things in the woods that move with purpose, that do not announce themselves but make their presence known through silence, through smell, through the feeling of your instincts screaming that something is wrong. The woods had always been a place of peace for my father before that night. But after, he still went camping, still loved nature, but he never again felt completely safe in the wild. He did some research in the years that followed, tried to rationalize what his father had seen. Some accounts mentioned creatures with glowing eyes, forest entities from folklore, and cryptids passed down in hushed stories told around campfires. Some said it was a Wendigo. Others said a shadow man. But none of the descriptions ever fully matched. The figure his father saw didn't act like a predator. It didn't try to approach or attack. It simply circled, like it was performing a ritual, like the fire had called it, or maybe it was guarding something. The silence of it was what haunted him most, a creature that large should have made noise, but it moved like mist. Over the years, my father returned to that memory the way someone might return to a turn to can't forget. He never once said the word monster. He said presence, figure, thing, but never gave it a name. That was deliberate. Giving it a name, he felt, gave it too much power. It wasn't just something they saw. It was something they had been allowed to see. As if it had chosen to reveal itself at one time, for reasons they'd never understand. And once it had, it vanished, leaving only the imprint of fear and the scent of something long dead. I sometimes wonder if the fire was what drew it in, if the warmth and light in the darkness disturbed it somehow. My grandfather always kept the fire going the rest of the night, refusing to let it die down, as if the flames were a barrier. He never went camping in that region again. And my father, though brave and logical, never slept soundly in the forest afterward. Even when surrounded by friends, even when there were no signs of danger, he kept one eye open, listening, watching, remembering the yellow eyes in the dark. Now, when I go camping with my own kids, I carry the story like a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. I teach them respect for the woods, not fear but reverence. We are guests in nature, and sometimes the hosts come out to see who's arrived. I still sit by the fire late into the night, just as my grandfather did, and if ever the forest goes silent, if ever the air turns thick and the fire flickers in an odd way, I'll remember the figure with the glowing eyes and the way it moved like smoke around the flames, and I'll be ready, quiet, watching, just in case it decides to come back. Story 7. The Trapdoor Goblin. There's something peculiar about growing up in a home where the lines between reality and the unexplained blur like smudged ink on wet paper. My sister and I shared a room in a modest council house nestled on the edge of a small town in southwest England. The house itself wasn't sinister. It was about 70 years old, slightly overgrown out back, and bordered by a lane that led straight to the countryside. Our bedroom sat at the back of the house, adjacent to a small bathroom that featured a trapdoor leading to a large, dark attic. Most nights passed without event, but one afternoon in particular left a stain on our memory. That time has never truly erased. Our father, a kind yet complex man, worked as a tarot reader and claimed a deep connection with the unseen. Still, he tried to keep those parts of his life separate from us, not wanting to influence our young minds. My sister hated anything remotely paranormal, scary stories, dark rooms, even Halloween. But I was the opposite. I devoured ghost books and haunted history, drawn to the mystery like a moth to a candle flame. That afternoon, Mom was working a long shift, and Dad, feeling unwell, had put himself to bed in the room next door. My sister and I played quietly, our voices soft so as not to disturb him. The hallway outside was visible from where we sat since we didn't have a bedroom door at the time. It began with a soft click, a tiny, barely there sound coming from the bathroom next to us. We both paused, listening. Another small click, like a latch being nudged or a handle gently turning. Then came the voice. It sounded garbled, almost underwater, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of marbles. The voice was high-pitched and strange, like our father doing one of his funny impressions while gargling water. "Hello, children," it said. My sister froze. I laughed, thinking it was Dad playing a joke. "Hello," we replied. The voice giggled back, unintelligible but clearly mimicking human speech. It wanted us to come into the bathroom. Something wasn't right. We kept laughing nervously, trying to convince ourselves it was just our father being silly. But then the hallway door burst open and there he was, Dad, looking groggy and very, very angry. "Why are you shouting?" "I'm trying to sleep," he barked. I remember how cold my body went in that moment. My sister's face turned pale. "Weren't you just in the bathroom?" we asked. "I've been asleep," he said flatly. He checked the bathroom. Nothing. He even opened the attic trapdoor with a flashlight and peered inside. No sign of anything. Satisfied, or at least trying to convince himself, he went back to bed. But the fear in us had already begun to settle. We sat in silence for a while, hiding under a shared blanket listening. My sister whimpered softly. I shushed her, trying to be brave, but I was shaking too. Then came the clicking again, a sharper sound this time. The trap door above the bathroom creaked faintly. And then that voice, now louder, more garbled, less playful, angry even. It gurgled and clicked like something mocking speech, but not quite managing it. That was enough. We screamed. Dad ran out again, this time his expression less annoyed and more alarmed. He grabbed the flashlight, opened the attic hatch again, and searched more thoroughly, but still there was nothing to find. No animal, no person, just dust and insulation. We all went downstairs after that. Even Dad seemed shaken. Mom came home a few hours later, and when we told her what happened, she tried to reassure us. Probably a trick of the pipes or a sound from the street, she offered. But even she didn't sound convinced. My sister refused to use the bathroom alone for weeks afterward. And as much as I loved the strange and supernatural, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us that day. Something that knew how to mimic voices, how to call children close, how to wait behind walls with patient hunger. Years passed, and the memory softened until one day, while cleaning the garage, we found an old diary of my sister's. Inside was a childish drawing, two girls huddled under a blanket, wide eyes peeking out. Above them, a speech bubble from the bathroom door. "Hello, children." She had labeled the creature the goblin and described how it had called to us. When I confronted her, she laughed nervously and said she thought it was just a nightmare she'd written down. But we both knew it wasn't a dream. The diary confirmed what we had experienced. That shared terror couldn't be imagined. To this day, we don't know what it was. A trick of sound, a person hiding in the attic, but no footprints were found. No way in or out without a ladder. And the voice, it wasn't human. Not quite. Some say that the Fae, the old spirits of the land, can try to lure children into the dark, that if you follow them, you don't always come back. Others say houses remember their pasts. Maybe something old was hiding above our heads, waiting for attention. Whatever it was, it knew our names. It mimicked our father's playful tone. It wanted us to come closer, and it almost succeeded. Now I live in a different house, a quiet one, with no attic and no strange clicking from the walls. But some nights, when I'm just drifting to sleep, I remember that voice. "Hello, children," and I wonder what would have happened if we'd listened. If we'd walked into the dark, up into the attic, toward that trap door with nothing but a giggling voice for company. I like to think we made the right choice, that the blanket and our screams were enough to scare it away. But in my bones, I know it's still out there, whatever it was, waiting, watching, speaking in echoes just beyond the ceiling. Story 8. The Zigzag Light over Idaho. There are nights when the sky holds secrets, when the stars seem to shift just a little too quickly, and something ancient pulses behind the clouds. A few years ago, my family took a trip deep into the northern Idaho Panhandle, a remote region where the pines stand tall and dense, and the roads seem to disappear into mist. My dad and I were the last ones awake one night, sitting around the dying campfire, the only sound being the gentle rustle of the wind brushing through the trees. The dogs were already curled up asleep, and everyone else had gone to bed hours ago. The sky above us stretched wide and open, glowing faintly with starlight. That was when Dad looked up and whispered, "Hua, what is that?" I followed his gaze and froze. Above us, a light was dancing. No, zigzagging. Across the sky. It wasn't moving like a plane or even a shooting star. It darted left and right in sharp, angular paths, impossibly fast. There were no sounds of engines, no grin-like buzzing, and it was far too high up to be a toy weather balloon. For a minute we just sat there, watching it weave across the sky in a pattern that defied logic or understanding. It was like watching a laser pointer across a dark ceiling, except it was huge, alive, and moving through the night above us. Neither of us said much at the time. We were just too stunned, unsure if we were really seeing it, or if our eyes were playing tricks, but the light never flickered or faded. It just continued its impossible movements until it finally zipped out of sight. We sat for several more minutes, hoping it would come back, hoping for some kind of rational explanation, but the sky remained still, quiet once more. The stars blinked down like normal. The dogs didn't stir. It was as if whatever had just flown over us had never been there at all. A few years before that, I'd had another strange sighting, this one on the 4th of July, in southern Washington near the Idaho border. We were gathered with friends waiting for fireworks to start, staring up at the sky, when someone pointed to a purple light, unmoving and silent, high above us. It wasn't twinkling like a star, and it was too high for a drone. It just hovered like it was observing. A few people joked about it being a satellite or even a blimp, but no one could say for sure. What made it strange wasn't just that it was purple, but that it never moved the entire time the fireworks show went on. But the second the fireworks ended, the purple light sprang into motion. It zipped in a straight line, vanishing into the sky like it had been waiting for its cue to leave. It didn't drift or fall. It bolted. Everyone who had noticed it let out little gasps and glances. Even those who hadn't been paying attention earlier noticed the streak across the sky. I was with several friends who saw the whole thing, and we spent hours afterward trying to come up with an explanation. But none of us could. It was as if it had been watching us, waiting, and when the show was over, it took its leave. I've read plenty of theories since then. Government drones, weather balloons, satellites behaving oddly, or atmospheric reflections. I've seen debunking videos and skeptical threads, but nothing I've seen quite captures what I experienced. The zigzagging movement, the sudden vanishing acts, the silence, it didn't feel mechanical. It felt intelligent. Like something was out there not just flying but reacting, responding, even deciding. The strangest part was how calm I felt. It wasn't fear or panic. It was awe, as though the sky had peeled back just long enough for me to glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to see. I've tried to explain it to others since then, but it never comes out right. People raise eyebrows or offer polite nods, then shift the subject. I can't blame them. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd probably react the same way. But both times I had witnesses. My dad, my friends, people who had no reason to lie, no reason to imagine the same thing at the same time. That's what keeps me grounded, knowing I wasn't alone in seeing it, and knowing that even if the world doesn't believe me, I carry the truth of it inside me. Sometimes I wonder if the lights will come back. When I camp now, I always bring a good pair of binoculars. I keep my eyes on the sky more than I used to. There's something comforting in that. Watching the stars and remembering that moment of connection. I don't know what they were. Maybe they weren't alien. Maybe they were ours. Experimental crafts, secret tech. But even then, someone has to be controlling them. Someone has to be behind the decisions they made, the moment they chose to appear, and that mystery alone is enough to keep me looking up. And if they do return, I hope I'll be ready, not to run, not to record, but to understand. I don't need proof anymore. I've let go of the need to convince others. Now I just want to see it again, to feel that rush, that hush, that tiny pause in the fabric of the world, when something unknowable moves just above our heads. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be found, but I like to think it didn't mind being seen. Story 9. The Grinning Not Dog. There are some things you see on quiet roads at night that stay with you, not because they were loud or dangerous, but because they didn't fit. A few years back, my mum and I were driving home from visiting some friends at a new property we had just acquired in a quiet rural area. It was late in the evening, the kind of peaceful, tired quiet that settles after a day spent outside. My aunt was driving just ahead of us on the same stretch of winding road, and we were following close behind. There was nothing unusual about the drive, until we rounded a bend and saw something near the side of the road. At first, the headlights illuminated what we thought was a large dog. My mum even said aloud, "Look at the cute dog," before her words began to trail off. It wasn't a dog, or at least not like any dog we had ever seen. Its body was tall, almost too tall, and unnaturally wide, with matted black hair that hung in long strands, brushing the ground like a curtain. Its shape was all wrong, disproportionate, twisted in ways that made your skin crawl, even if you couldn't say exactly why. It stood in the headlights for only a few seconds, but long enough for both of us to take in every unsettling detail. Its face is what truly struck me. Large and expressionless, yet grinning, mouth slightly agape, revealing an unnatural stillness in its jaw. It was smiling, in the way a person smiles when they know something you don't. Its eyes were yellow, glowing faintly, not from reflection, but like lanterns burning from within, and though our car windows were rolled up and lightly tinted, I could feel it staring directly at us. My mother went silent, her breath caught in her throat. I felt that deep internal chill that doesn't come from the outside air but from something else, something older. I turned my head away quickly, refusing to meet its gaze again. My mum muttered, "It isn't a dog," her voice cracking as she tried to process what she'd just seen. I nodded, unable to speak. The creature moved with a gait that wasn't natural, like a human crawling on all fours but exaggerated, too fluid and too slow. Its long limbs didn't seem to bend in the right places. The way it moved reminded me of someone wearing a heavy pelt, something thrown over them, loose and dragging. It crossed the road and slipped into the darkness of the woods. Then it was gone, just like that. The silence it left behind felt heavier than before. When we got home, we expected my aunt to bring it up, but she never did. We asked her if she'd seen the dog we passed. She looked confused and said no. She hadn't noticed anything. My mother and aunt are both animal lovers. There's no way they wouldn't at least glance at an animal on the roadside, but she claimed she saw nothing, like the thing had revealed itself only to us. Inside the house, the air felt heavier than usual, like something had followed us, and now lingered just out of sight. We didn't talk much. There wasn't anything else to say. Later that night, my mum and I sat together, still shaken. She admitted that when the thing looked into the car, she didn't just feel watched. She felt like her thoughts were being read. "It knew I knew," she said softly. It was a chilling thing to hear, because I'd felt the same. There had been a kind of mental pressure, like a buzzing behind the eyes, that made me avert my gaze instinctively. It wasn't just seeing a creature. It was being seen by something that was playing a role, pretending to be a dog but failing to hide the truth completely. I've had other strange experiences before, but this one felt deeply personal. The way it made eye contact, the grin, the posture, it was more than just a sighting. It was an interaction, a performance. It had shown itself to us on purpose, maybe to scare us, maybe to see how we'd react. Or maybe it was testing how far it could push the boundary between blending in and revealing too much. Whatever the case, I knew immediately that it wasn't a cryptid, an animal, or some night-bound illusion. It was something pretending to be part of our world but not quite succeeding. Since that night, I've done research. Skinwalker legends, shapeshifters, folklore from old European forests, dogmen. None of them fully matched. The hair was too long. The movements were wrong. The energy wasn't animal. It was theatrical, rehearsed, like it had put on a costume and was playing a part, but forgot how to act human halfway through the scene. And when we looked away, it left, as if its role was finished, as if the scene had ended. That was the part that disturbed me the most. Not that we saw something strange, but that it had planned for us to see it. I've never seen it again. I hope I never do. But sometimes when I drive alone at night in the trees close in, I think of it. That not dog. That crooked, grinning thing that looked like it had crawled out of some forgotten play, dressed in rags and shadows, and I wonder how many others have seen it, only to deny it or forget. I wonder how many pass it off as imagination, never realizing that they weren't the ones watching it was. Story 10. The Tree with a Door. When I was a child, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the forest behind his property, stories that drifted between folklore and truth, always with a gleam in his eye and a caution in his tone. One story always stood out. He told me that deep in the woods, far off the trails and beyond the reach of the sun, there was a tree with a door, not a hollow trunk or a knothole, but an actual wooden door carved perfectly into the base of the tree. He claimed it had no hinges, no handle, and no lock, just a smooth, perfectly fitted seam and a feeling that you weren't supposed to open it. I thought he was just trying to keep me out of the forest, but now, I'm not so sure. Years later, after he passed, I inherited his cabin. It was rustic, tucked into the edge of the same deep woods I'd played near as a kid, but I hadn't been back in nearly 2 decades. The air was as still as I remembered, the trees taller than I recalled, and the silence somehow heavier. I stayed a few days to sort through his things, and on the 3rd day, I felt an urge I hadn't felt since childhood. I wanted to find that tree. I didn't really believe in it, not anymore, but something about the forest called to me. So I grabbed my flashlight and went in just before dusk with no clear destination, only a direction. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest felt. The trees seemed closer together, the underbrush too still, the usual forest sounds, chirping birds, insects, the occasional snap of a branch were absent. After what felt like an hour of wandering, I stumbled into a small clearing, and there it was, a massive tree with a base far wider than the others, bark that looked smoother, darker, and in the middle of that trunk, about 3 feet from the ground, was a perfectly rectangular wooden door, no hinges, no handle, just like he'd described. My breath caught in my chest. At first I stood frozen. I reached out, touched the wood. It was colder than I expected, and the grain was too perfect, like it had been manufactured, not grown. The seam was so fine I could barely slip a fingernail into it. I pressed gently, and the door didn't budge, but the moment I touched it, the air shifted. It became thicker, warmer, as if the tree had exhaled. The leaves above rustled, though there was no wind. I took a step back. Everything in my body told me not to open it, that this door wasn't meant for me or anyone. I turned to leave, but then I heard something behind me. A whisper. My name, so soft it could have been the wind. I looked back at the tree, and I swear the seam in the door was gone. The surface was now completely smooth, like the door had never existed. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The seam returned. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away slowly, flashlight beam shaking as I turned and started making my way back to the cabin. Every step away from the tree felt like swimming through syrup, like the air itself didn't want me to leave. When I finally emerged from the woods, the stars were out. I didn't remember the walk being that long, but somehow 3 hours had passed. My watch had stopped. My phone had lost all battery, despite being nearly full before I went in. That night I sat on the porch and listened. The forest had returned to its normal self, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, but I couldn't shake the image of that door, of the whisper, of the way the tree seemed to breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the fire, turning over every detail in my mind, trying to make sense of something that didn't belong in this world. The next morning I debated going back, but something told me not to. I wasn't afraid exactly. It was something else, a deep primal respect. That door wasn't just strange, it was sacred. My grandfather had warned me for a reason. I don't think he was trying to scare me. I think he was trying to protect me. Maybe he'd seen it too. Maybe that door had always been there, waiting for the right person to open it, or the wrong one. Either way, I knew I couldn't go back. Not alone. Not without answers I wasn't sure I wanted. I left the cabin a day earlier than planned, locked it up, left the keys with my uncle, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. But the image of the door stayed with me. I started drawing it in my journal. I researched old forest myths. I found references to gateway trees in Celtic and Norse folklore, old stories about doors between worlds, hidden paths, and sentient woods. Some believed they were entrances to the underworld. Others thought they were prisons for something that should never be freed. The more I read, the more I understood why my grandfather never went near it again. To this day, I still dream of that tree. Sometimes the door is open. Sometimes there's light pouring out. Other times there's only darkness. And I hear my name again, softer each time. I haven't returned to the cabin, but I know it's still there, waiting in the same clearing, silent and eternal. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I had pushed a little harder, if the door had opened, if I had stepped through. But the wondering always ends the same way, sitting up in bed, heart racing, knowing that some doors aren't meant to be opened, especially the ones in trees.